to this. So I'll hand you straight over to Seán. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm going to start by thanking Cara Trant of the Kerry Writers Museum for inviting me to speak about faction fighting in Kerry, and thank also those of you who are attending via Zoom. This is what I wrote yesterday. I should say that I don't have a lot of experience of using Zoom, and my internet connection isn't particularly strong, but hopefully we should proceed without too many hitches. So maybe that was fortuitous. This talk flows from the research and writing of a book called Days of the Blackthorn, which was published by Mercier Press in January. Given that this talk is hosted by the Writers Museum, I am going to start by briefly explaining why I wrote about the phenomenon of faction fighting. After that, I will give an overview of some of the factions who fought in County Kerry, along with some descriptions of particular faction fighters. And when I finish, there will be an opportunity for people to ask any questions that they may have. So, why I wrote a book about faction fighting? I had believed that my first encounter with the term faction fighting began when a customer in the bookshop I was working in Tralee during the 1990s asked me for a copy of Patrick O'Donnell's book, The Irish Faction Fighters of the 19th Century, which had been published in 1975. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe you could show the slide of the cover, Cara. It's the one with the kind of the green cover.
Yeah, I've moved on.
Okay, good. Okay, my screen is blank. The man who asked me about the book was elderly, and I took him to be a farmer. He seemed mightily disappointed when we didn't have the book. It had been out of print for many years, but I remained curious myself, however. What was faction fighting? I hadn't heard of the term, but I subsequently found out that it referred to gangs of countrymen attacking each other with hard sticks at fairs and other gatherings. I managed to get a second-hand copy of O'Donnell's book, and I was amazed at what I read there. Scores or hundreds of men and women assembled at fairs and at pattern days at holy wells or at race meetings to fight each other, often suffering terrible injuries and often death. It was also apparent that a particularly violent encounter had taken place at Ballyeagh Strand near Ballybunion in 1834. When I came to talk about my own work at the book launch for Days of the Blackthorn, held at Killarney Library, I had figured that that had been my introduction to the subject. I only remembered when I was preparing for the launch that in fact I had had an encounter with the subject when I was a young child. My father's family were from County Roscommon, and on holidays there during the summer, I often found myself in shops that were part sweet shop, part newsagent, and part tourist souvenir shop. There inevitably would be a large rack of long polished sticks with large lumps of wood at the top of them. The sticks were painted black and varnished. "What are those?" I asked my father one day. The reason I long remembered the conversation was because his reply was uncharacteristically dismissive. "Oh, they're just what American tourists think that the Irish are all about," he declared, and he would say no more. Because I didn't understand his explanation, it remained in my mind for a good long time. Returning to modern times, when I moved to Cork City for a period a few years ago, I was working with the Cork Folklore Project. The project collects the urban folklore of the communities of the north side of the city. In the Shandon area of the city, we learned of a group of men who were actually continuing the stick fighting tradition. Under the instruction of a martial arts teacher, older men in the community were being taught how to wield the sticks known as shillelaghs. I went to an open day held by the group, and I was amazed at the cracking sounds that sticks made upon sticks, and at the fact that when I was invited to hold a fighting stick, my hand naturally rose up about a third of the way along it, because more of the weight of the stick was at the top. This was also the manner in which fighters were enabled to protect their forearms and elbows. Both of those factors were described in historical accounts, and there I was experiencing them for myself. You can show the slide there, Cara, with fighters holding the sticks in the middle. Moving forward to 2013, I came to write a short history of Puck Fair, which was published by the History Press. I was then living a couple of miles outside Killorglin. Obviously, drinking, brawling, and faction fighting were huge elements of the fair during the 19th century, and it became clear that a man called Big Mick Foley and the Foley faction of Killorglin were for a long time the most powerful party on the streets there. But afterwards, the question naturally arose inside me: who else fought in the other districts of County Kerry? I had read of the great fight at Ballyeagh between the Cooleens and the Lawlors, but who fought elsewhere, say in East Kerry, or on the Dingo Peninsula, or in Killarney? And why on earth did they fight, given that the penalties in terms of injuries, death, or imprisonment were so devastating to both the fighters and their families? It also appeared to me that the bizarre phenomenon might have gone on for over 200 years, both locally and nationally. Yet today it does not feature as a subject of discussion among people interested in Irish history. I also noticed that most people over 50 years of age knew about faction fighting and nodded readily when I mentioned it, but the younger people did not. And when I explained to the latter what faction fighting involved, they could hardly believe it. The common reaction among that group was surprise. It also quickly became clear, once I began some research into the subject, that after Irish independence was achieved, or partly achieved, depending on your point of view, faction fighting was an aspect of Irish life that was no longer going to be talked about, or if talked about, only to be condemned. So this book was written because the subject was so unusual, so violent, and so forgotten. Also, here was something that to me personally had long been intriguing, and which, as far as I was concerned, cried out to be exhumed and re-examined. In addition, the publication by James Kelly of a study of 18th century factions in Dublin City, titled The Liberty and Ormond Boys, and there's a slide there, suggested to me that there might be a space for another regional study of faction fighting in Ireland. Having already written about faction fighting in Killorglin, and having lived all over County Kerry for most of 30 years, it seemed natural for me to focus on the factions of County Kerry. I had written an article about faction fighting in Cork City and County for the Cork Folklore Project, and at first I thought I might make the book about the factions of both Cork and Kerry. It soon became apparent, however, that there was enough material to focus exclusively on Kerry, and that I ran the risk of creating a larger book that might become a far too repetitious catalogue of fights, beatings, battles, head wounds, deaths, police baton charges, court cases, and priestly denunciations. In more general terms as well, faction fighting was attractive to me because it forms another vigorous element of that vigorous Irish life which appears to have existed in the decades before the famine. This period of Irish history really appeals to me. Here was a popular culture of drinking, illegal distilling, dancing and music making, of attending riotous Pattern Day celebrations, of going horse racing and playing hurling, of gambling and hunting with hounds. Into that rich, racy life, faction fighting certainly fitted perfectly. Ireland after 1798 and before 1845 is also turbulent politically, with the rise of Daniel O'Connell, the campaign for Catholic emancipation, the campaign for the repeal of the parliamentary union with Britain, and so on. A further element that was appealing to me was the possibility of learning in some slight detail about the lives of ordinary Kerry people during 1820s and 1830s. In reports and reminiscences of faction fighting, we come face to face with these men and women and the lives they led in a way that no report of a popular political meeting nor of the doings of elite political figures would ever provide. So for these reasons, I spent 2.5 years researching and writing this book in an effort to describe and understand factions of Kerry. So you might show the slide of my book cover there. So this next section is called Introduction to Faction Fighting. And you can show a slide of a man with a fighting stick with a blue background, if that's there. Faction fighting was the practice of gangs of Irishmen meeting to battle each other with cudgels and sticks. The occasions for faction fights were most often fair days, when farmers and factions from different districts milled together in one spot. They also took place on Sundays, on Saints' patron days, and on holy days, such as St. Stephen's Day and St. Patrick's Day. In other words, on days when no work had to be done. The phenomenon occurred from at least the 1600s, but flourished most dramatically during the early 19th century. After the famine, it continued more sporadically, and it lingered in very isolated episodes into the first years of the 20th century. Factions were gangs which were usually comprised of a prominent local family and its extended kinship network, mixed in with a collection of neighbours, allies, and associates who felt an attachment or loyalty to them, all fighting under the name of the leader's family or under a nickname. In Tipperary, there were the Caravasts and the Shanavests, for example. The name of the first group appears to have derived from the fact that the men wore cravats, while that of their rivals arose from their wearing old waistcoats, Seán in Irish. In Kerry, factions generally bore the surname of the most prominent or founding family of the faction. Irish-born writers Samuel Carter Hall and his wife Anna Maria in 1841 portrayed faction fighting as having been an ancient distinguishing characteristic of Ireland. And they wrote, "There was scarcely a district in Ireland that did not recognise some hereditary dispute, and it became a sort of duty for a member of one family to insult a member of another family whenever they chanced to meet. Every relation of each, no matter how distant, was expected to stand by his faction, and times and places were regularly appointed where they might meet to fight it out. The majority of the combatants, in 9 cases out of 10, were utterly ignorant of what they were fighting for, and the leaders were seldom acquainted with the original cause of the quarrel." Kerry writer Con Houlihan in Modern Times described faction fighting in these terms: "It was the national neurosis. No Irishman felt whole unless he had an enemy." Motivations for fighting varied. Faction fights were assessed by many commentators and participants as activities in which men engaged for the sheer love of fighting. In 1835, the observant French traveller Alexis de Tocqueville felt that factions fought for the sole pleasure of the excitement that a fight gives. Faction fights were thus partly examples of what modern scholars call recreational violence. In her analysis of Irish faction fighting, historian Carolyn Connolly commented that the goal of recreational violence was not to injure or kill as such, but rather to participate in a mutual display of skill and strength, she wrote. The characters who emerge from the criminal records are more often people who enjoyed fighting as a sometimes lethal but rarely malicious form of entertainment. Other fights and factions functioned to give vent to particular grudges and grievances. An army officer who witnessed a fight in North Kerry in 1827 asked a faction leader afterwards for the reason behind the quarrel between two men and their parties. And he was told that it was about a girl I wouldn't marry. And he brought his faction against us, and we fought it out and beat them like men. Some faction feuds, perhaps most of them, originally derived from specific root causes. The lengthy antipathy between the Fitzgeralds and the O'Keefes of East Kerry was sparked by the abduction or elopement of a woman from one of the families. Fighting served emotional and psychological needs too. By this public display of violent skill, men could gain favorable reputations and status within their own communities, and be praised in contemporary story, song, or verse. We are reminded here of J.M. Synge's Playboy of the Western World, where the hero is admired for his display of violence in apparently killing his father. In Kerry, stories about Seón Burns of the Cooleens and songs about Big Mick Foley from Killorglin remained part of the folklore of the districts for 100 years after they flourished their sticks. A German traveller called Hermann Fürst von Buchler-Muskau, who toured Ireland, including Kerry, witnessed a fight in Kenmare in September 1828. And there should be a slide of him there. He wrote, "It was fair time when I arrived in Kenmare, and I could hardly penetrate through the bustling crowd with my one-horse vehicle, especially from the number of drunken men who would not, perhaps could not, get out of the way. One of them fell in consequence of an attempt to do so, and knocked his head so violently on the pavement that he was carried away senseless, a thing of such common occurrence that it attracted no attention. Afterwards, the visitor dined with a window view of the street, and he saw several stick fights and gave a vivid description of one which may stand as an example. First, a knot of people collect, shouting and screaming. This rapidly thickens, and all at once, in the twinkling of an eye, 100 shillelaghs whirl in the air, and the thumps, which are generally applied to the head, bang and snap like the distant report of firearms, till one party has gained the victory. Afterwards, his host in Kenmare managed to get him one of the sticks he had used in the fight. Through the mediation of mine host, I bought one of the finest specimens of this weapon, yet warm from the fight. It is as hard as iron, and that it may be sure to do execution, it is also weighted at the end with lead." Early factions of Kerry. There should be a slide of a sketch of a Kerry man. Faction fighting goes back a long time in the traditions of Irish life. Establishing that fact and finding brief examples was particularly rewarding to me as I carried out research, because it altered the notion that faction fighting was entirely a 19th century phenomenon that was only related to the culture and conditions of that century. The wielding of the stick was noted in Irish culture from the 17th century. The poet Eadwy Mccarthy wrote a poem which has been ascribed to the early 1600s, in which he mocked men who went drinking at fairs, took sticks in their fists, and set to battering each other. A traveller who journeyed in Ireland between 1675 and 1680 noted that a fair in County Kerry was famous for quarrels between two rival families. In 1695, the Irish Parliament passed the Sunday Observance Act, which prohibited playing with cudgels as well as engaging in other activities on the holy day. By 1726, the Kerry poet Murroch O'Connor could write of faction fighting as the continuation of an old tradition, which he called this ancient custom. Just as elsewhere in the country, fighting at fairs may have been a feature of Kerry life as early as the 1600s. Richard O'Connell, the vicar of the Diocese of Kerry from about 1611, who died in 1653, was afterwards said to have regularly attended fairs and public gatherings in all the towns of his diocese, especially Killarney, Castlemaine, Tralee, and Ardfert, to try and curb drinking and fighting. Firmer hints of factions and stick fighters appear in the first decades of the 18th century. In the year 1714, it was reported that the leader of his clan, the O'Donoghue of Killarney, often brags that he has 500 men at his command, and that a man named George Eager, having committed an affray in the town, threatened the local justice that he would beat him with a great cudgel he brandished in his hand, as long as his stick would last. Several references to faction fighting as a contemporary practice of the early 1700s were made in Moraghan O'Connor's poem, A Description of the County of Kerry. And there should be a slide of the cover of O'Connor's book and a slide of one of his verses. This is the picture he painted. Off go the hats and coats, the fight begins. Some strike the heads, whilst others strike the shins. The winding cudgels round their foreheads play. They need no leaders to begin the fray. The governor of Roscastle near Killarney complained in 1729 of bands of men in the area who were continually in riots, all of whom were protected by different clans. Established factions of the Castle Island area were reported to have sprung up around the 1740s or 1760s. In May 1762, a man named John Connor was charged that at the fair of Ardfert, with an oak stick or cudgel of the value of sixpence, then and there held in his right hand, he gave John Jemison, in and upon the right side of the head, a mortal wound of the depth of 3 inches and the breadth of 1 inch. On the Dingo Peninsula, around the year 1780, there was a fencing master in the parish, wrote Thomas McSheehy of Ballyferriter, who had the information through the recollections of his father, Padraig. And all of the young men in the parish would come to him to be taught, he said. The instructor was one Gearóid O'Mweny from Rathkeil, County Limerick. The fencing masters used to have them very well trained at the sticks, McSheehy explained. The master had 2 sticks and the learner had 2 sticks. The men were very keen and eager at the art of stick fighting. It was rare that anyone was badly hurt in the feuds, as they were extremely adept and knowledgeable in how to defend themselves and in how to avoid the blows. The most famous factions of Kerry, the Cooleens and the Lawlors of the north of the county, were reported to have been established from about 1784. In 1790, a French visitor noted of Kerry men generally, on Sundays they attend patrons, almost all of them dressed in blue, each man with a baton in his hand. These sticks are held in the middle in order to strike an opponent on the head, and their owners use them with heartfelt joy to attack each other at fairs. At one time there were special teachers to teach this cudgel game. Perhaps such people are still to be found. In 1794, a John Day, who was sentenced to death after shooting a man near Tralee, requested to be buried with his wooden leg, which together with his cudgel, he requested to have laid beside him in his coffin. In August 1798, it was reported in a newspaper that at a skirmish at a fair in the county of Kerry, 3 yeomen, who were members of a local defence force who were sometimes deployed for policing duties, they were killed in an incident which had been attributed to rebellious principles among the peasantry of that quarter. But by several letters from that county, it appears to have been merely one of those factious broils, meaning faction fight, between 2 contending parties or feudal clans, not uncommon in the most peaceable times in many parts of this kingdom. If factions flourished so early, so too did celebrated fighters among them. Daniel O'Donoghue, who died in 1790, was known as the O'Donoghue of the Glens, and he led parties of men from Glenflesk, where he had his estates, into battle on Killarney streets during the 1770s. He was a man of gigantic size and truly barbarian spirit, somewhat tinctured with insanity, it was later related. The writer described a remarkably tall and strong man, and he continued, many persons who saw Daniel in his old age have described him to us, and it is plain he would have been a formidable antagonist. Though, of course, much fallen then, he was still a huge skeleton. His jaws, said a gentleman to us, resembled a horse's, and the children of Killarney used to break themselves in buying apples for him to eat. It was the greatest delight to see the huge working of his jaws, and Daniel would easily devour a basketful, so that he had always a crowd of urchins after him through the streets. But this never gave him any annoyance. He was as simple as one of themselves. At a large patron once, he was attacked by the faction of the Eagers and got a great beating, but no man could knock him down. At last, he became completely roused. He ran to an old cabin and laid about him with one of the rafters until he cleared the field. In short, he was a giant. You could put a young child into his shoe, and his voice was so deep and hollow that one would think it came out of the bowels of the earth. The village of Glenflesk was then inhabited by a fine race of people, it was said, stout, tall, hardy mountaineers. And these fellows, under the countenance of their chieftain, rode roughshod over the town of Killarney. On every fair and market day they marched through it, shouting, hallooing, and offering £5 for the head of any man that would dare oppose them. The writer went on to detail how O'Donoghue and his faction came to their end. At last, the people of Killarney became quite indignant at the tyranny of the Glenflegians and determined to throw off their yoke. The fair day of Killarney was fixed for that purpose, and both parties prepared themselves accordingly. When it came, the stout, wealthy farmers poured in, and the town itself furnished an excellent force. The Glenflegians in a large body marched as usual through the streets, dancing out of their skins, shouting and haranguing. O'Donoghue in a gold-laced hat and coat was at their head. At first men shunned O'Donoghue. His clan were attacked with right goodwill, but no one forgot the old respect entertained for him, until a miner named Larry, a man of great strength and courage, coming up to O'Donoghue with a fine blackthorn stick, exclaimed, "By God, I'll never go to the feet while I've the head." He struck him and sent his gold-laced hat whistling up into the air. It will give you a notion of O'Donoghue. He struck Larry in return with his open hand and felled him to the earth, where he remained for a long time spouting blood through his mouth and ears. But after that, O'Donoghue and his Glenflegians were attacked without distinction. At length, numbers prevailed, and the Glenflegians were wholly defeated. They were chased a mile out of the town. Faction violence continued to flourish into the early years of the 19th century. By the 1820s, it had become a permanent feature of country life in Kerry, as indicated by the following conversation. John Houlihan was questioned in court about a fight he had attended in Lisselton on St. Patrick's Day, 1825, in which a man named Hennessy had been killed. He was examined by Daniel O'Connell, and this exchange took place. And there should be a slide of Daniel O'Connell there somewhere. "You went to the fair by appointment?" O'Connell asked. "I did." "Now what business had you there?" "To fight, to be sure. What other business would I have there?" "Why did you make an appointment on that particular day?" "Because the parties had agreed on the Sunday before to meet in order to have a fight. And would you have me be absent on such an occasion?" "How many fights have you been in?" O'Connell asked him. "For how long?" "For your whole life." "Oh, you're not serious. How could I tell?" he replied. Could you even give a guess? I could not indeed. Could you tell me how many battles you have been in for the last 3 years? I could not, without taking a great deal of time to calculate. Now, Houlihan, by virtue of your oath, did you ever see a fight that your teeth did not water to be in the middle of? The man replied, why sure, one could not see two dogs fighting without wishing to take part with one or another of them. It might be best now to give you some idea of the range of faction activity within Kerry. Here then are some fights, fighters and factions from different regions of the county. We start with the Dingo Peninsula. The main stage for faction fighting on the peninsula was Ballinclare Fair near Annascaul, which had been established since 1758 and which was held every May Day and 4th of October. A select number of established gangs fought there, and among the most preeminent were the Kennedys. The family's grandparents on their father's side had come to Kerry from Nina, County Tipperary. They had been transplanted to Kerry around 1656 by the Earl of Cork and Orrery, along with a number of other families from the county. The Kennedy faction was led by Tig Kennedy, who wielded a favourite stick which he called Bás gan Sagart, death without a priest. He himself carried the unusual nickname, Who's Afraid? A local folklore interviewee later explained, he used to take off his coat and drag it about the field shouting, Who's afraid? In a defying manner. Anyone who stepped on the coat would start the faction fight. And there should be a slide there of somebody dragging their coat. Tig's heyday appears to have been during the 1820s and 1830s. One day, long after that, possibly during the 1860s, and when he was an old man, he was called into action again, a local man later remembered. Another of the former Tipperary families, the Cooleens, which the witness described as a strong faction from Dingle, appeared at the fair, who meant to give battle to the Kennedys and beat them. Their arrival was a great surprise to the Kennedy faction, and they sent word around to muster full strength for the fight. This is his description. The Cooleens, being a much stronger faction, succeeded after a long time in driving the Kennedys out on the road and was beating towards Annascaul village. Reinforcements coming, the Kennedys fought fiercely and every foot of road was fiercely contested. Tig Kennedy was a very old man at this time and was unable to come to the Ballinclare Fair. However, he happened to be out in his farm looking at sheep, and from where he was, he saw the great battle raging in the distance. When he saw his clan being beaten back, his old fury returned once again. He came down to his own house, and much to his surprise, he saw his own son sitting near the fire. This added more to his temper, and he said to his son, "Is it there you are, sitting down near the fire, and our clan beaten and killed along the road to Annascaul? You should be ashamed of yourself, a young man like you." When the young man heard that, he jumped up and got his stick and was about to start off to join his clan. "Don't go yet," said old Tig. "Tig will be with you." He took down his Bás gan Sagart, and with his son's assistance, he reached the scene of the fight. When the Kennedys saw him, it gave them new courage. He started shouting words of encouragement to them and giving orders in general. The fight became very fierce and buckets of blood were spilled. The Kennedys being reinforced, they succeeded in driving the Cooleens back a small bit, but after another while it became evident that the Kennedys were getting the best of the fight, and the Cooleens started to retreat. However, they fought, still retreating, a half a mile of the road back, and at last they were forced to run through the fields. The other great faction of the Dingo Peninsula were the Fitzgeralds, also known as Nigaraltig or the Mccarthys. They sometimes fought against the Moriarty faction at Ballinclare. Patrick Foley, a writer who published two somewhat obscure books about the folklore and history of Corcaguini, and who was seemingly a native of the barony, explained, "The way these fights usually started was a hero follower of the Fitzgeralds, primed with drink, would prance through the fair, waving his Blackthorn cudgel, and at the same time shouting for a Moriarty. Then a fight was started in which whole parishes became involved," reported a folklore informant. "They fought each other without any individual ill will, using stumps of firs, sticks of hawthorn or oak as their weapons. Sometimes big fights were started by a man holding out a stick and having one member of a faction spit on it, and asking a man of the opponent's faction then to let him spit on. If he did, this was a challenge, and the fight started. The party's enmity was believed to have had an origin which must strike us as quite remarkable. Patrick Foley stated that the origin of these factional fights in those parts was the betrayal of the Earl of Desmond, a Fitzgerald, by a Moriarty. This was an event which had taken place in 1583. Of course, whether the feud had continued from the 1580s onwards, or was a later eruption which merely utilized a distant historical incident as a handy taunt is another matter. Turning to the opposite side of the county, to East Kerry and Slieve Lucra, the two foremost gangs of the area were known as the Geraltig and the Dahinig. The Dahinig meant the followers of Dahi or David O'Keefe. Both gangs included several Kerry families, although many of their fights took place in Knocknagree, County Cork, just beyond the Kerry county bounds. The Geraltig were led by Andy Sheehan from Kilcummin, while the Dahinig were captained by Darby Moynihan from Guineguilla. The party sprang to life around 1825. Like some other feuds, the enmity had its origin in a dispute over a woman, although there are two contrasting accounts. Apparently, an affront was committed by an O'Keefe against a Fitzgerald. A folklore informant stated, David O'Keefe of Cullen had arranged to elope with Ellen Fitzgerald, but her brothers heard of it and attacked David O'Keefe after Mass, either in Cullen village or in the vicinity. From that little brawl, the fight grew. Every Sunday the parties met, and their numbers gradually grew until it attained huge proportions in 1859 or 1860. As each Knocknagree fair day drew near, messengers were dispatched to summon the rival gangs, it was said. After the business of the fair day was completed, each faction would assemble in the fair field. A folklore source explained, a bugle was sounded as a signal to tent owners to pack up their wares. And there should be a slide of a bugler there somewhere. To pack up their wares and move to safer quarters. Prior to the bugle call, each faction filled the shebeens of the village. They often drank as much as 4 gallons of whiskey before the fight. At the bugle call, they lined up, and one would take off his coat and drag it after him along the fair field towards the opposing faction, shouting, "Who dares to tread on the tail of my coat?" An opponent would do so, and then a melee started. The fight finished when one faction retreated in front of the other. Often men from opposing sides drank together when the fight was over. The fight was fought with a clean, manly spirit, and only those whose skulls were able to withstand a strong blow took part in the fray. Among the fighters for the Geraltig was one Bill Mccarthy, described as a notorious man who would travel from Killarney. He was about 6 feet in height, the folklore informant said, and had a broken hip. He was never beaten till he came to Knocknagree. One fair day about 60 years ago, he came with the Daly clan from Kilsarkin and being unable to get any man to fight him, he started punching a big horse. Every fighting man in the place ran from him. He looked so terrible with his yellow baffety shirt and corduroy trousers. A baffety shirt was a shirt made of coarse cloth. He was a bossing boy by the dailies and would kill a person for 2 pints of porter. A bossing boy was a cudgel fighter. One day he paid for his fighting, continued the informant. Con Totally, the famous Shanballa highwayman, struck him with his stirrup iron and broke all the teeth in the front of his mouth. The long-running feud was at its highest in 1859 or 1860, reported folklore collector Diarmuid O'Minicoin. He explained that the Geraltig and the Heenig battles ended when 18 men from each side were sent to the Cork County Jail on hard labour for 4 months. The last big faction fight was in October 1860. Thus, a dispute over a woman which had taken place in 1825 had gone on to fuel 35 years of faction fights. Perhaps now would be an appropriate moment to mention a crucial fact about the factions. That is that they were usually run by farmers, more correctly by what were later termed strong farmers. And there should be a slide there of a well-dressed farmer in a waistcoat. Of what class in life are the leaders of those clans? A parliamentary committee asked in 1824. They are generally farmers or the sons of farmers, replied a witness. In Kerry, the factions of the Sullivans and Reardons of Castlemaine, for example, were said to be headed by the richest farmers on the banks of the Main. It was explained by a local historian in 1868 in relation to the factions of the Cooleens and the Lawlors. Compared with the majority of the fighting men, the leaders were respectable. They were for the most part farmers, while the rank and file were tradesmen and farm servants. There were many others who were distinguished for personal bravery, but whose social standing did not warrant higher ranks than lieutenant and aide-de-camp. A case in point about wealthy farmers would be the Foley family of Killorglin. They were strong farmers of Anglunt, a townland near Killorglin, overlooking the River Lown, which flows through the town. Unusually, they had become prominent in the locality during the last quarter of the 18th century, ceasing to be tenant farmers and instead buying out their lands from the Mccarthy of Dungiel, a Catholic landowner who had fallen into financial difficulties in the 1770s. The Foleys benefited from associations with local Protestant landowners too, leasing lands from the Bannerhassets, whom the Foleys accordingly supported in general elections and in the faction fights between the supporters of rival candidates that sometimes went with those elections. The Foleys also bought the right to hold the August Fair of Killorglin, subsequently famous as Puck Fair, from the Mullins family. From the Foleys sprang a famous faction fighter, Michael James Foley, born in 1783. He was said to have been 6 feet 4 inches in height and derived his nickname, Big Mick, from his great strength and size. Michael was both a fighter and a sportsman. A man remembered in 1894 that during the 1820s, football was played with a heavy ball made of a donkey's bladder tied around with cord, that only Big Mick Foley of Killorglin and Brian Connor of Tralee could raise with a kick. Similarly, at a hurling match in Killorglin in 1824, it was said that 4 parishes, 2 against 2, were pitted at a place where there is a huge mound, over which Big Mick drove the 10-pound ball in a puckinardia that finished the game. A puckinardia being a high kick. Michael appears to have been involved in faction fighting mostly during the first 2 decades of the 1800s. Mick had made his mark in many a row, even as a stripling, i.e. a young man, remembered an elderly letter writer to the Kerry Sentinel. Some bouts took place at Killorglin, others at Kilgovnet, a hamlet a few miles from the town, which held an important fair on the 11th of February. The Kilgovnet fair ran for 3 days and featured up to 200 tents where whiskey was sold to the fairgoers. There was horse racing over ditches and nothing but singing and dancing carried on. The letter writer recalled the story of a stick fight on a certain day there, which featured Big Mick, when a collision of the mob with the Milltown yeomanry took place. The time span in which this incident occurred may be inferred from the account of another correspondent, who said it played out in the presence of the newly established police, the earliest version of which operated in Kerry from around 1791, and who also said that Michael was afterwards charged before Judge Robert Day, who retired from the bench in 1819. So this took place sometime between 1791 and 1819. The correspondent recalled, "I had a talk many years ago with Dennis Casey. Casey was himself a famous faction fighter from Glenflesk. He witnessed the fray and took part in many a fray in Killorglin. Casey was a left-hander and could whirl 2 sticks on occasion. When the yeomanry were routed, Casey saw one of them, a relative and a friend of his, in sore distress. Casey flew to his assistance, whirling his 2 cudgels to make room, but it was too late. The beaten man was past friendly aid. Dennis Casey said it was the wild Ivra devils and their neighbours of Glenbeigh, who turned what was merely a scrimmage as usual at fairs into the life and death conflict of this unhappy event. He said that Mick Foley, then only a stripling, did wonders in saving life that day. Mick saw 2 yeomen thrown into the river, then in full flood. He seized a pony, jumped on his back, and plunged into the stream, just in time to collar the 2 men and drag them, only half alive, to the opposite shore. Fights also took place in Killorglin as well as Kilgovnet. At the August Fair of 1819, an eyewitness later reported that the custom of raising and displaying a puck goat could not be carried out due to the outbreak of a faction fight. And there should be a slide of puck fair there. One Sunday in January 1820, a fight was prevented by the combined forces of local priest Father Looney, a local magistrate, and the military. Hundreds of fighters poured into the village to decide a battle between 2 factions. And the conflict was only prevented after magistrates and the militia surrounded the house where some of the chiefs of one of the parties were. Afterwards, one of the leaders was reported to have said to one of his opponents, "Surely it is well known, if we were allowed to meet this day, we would not have left one of you alive in the town." It is tempting to think that this statement was made by Big Mick Foley himself. By 1835, however, Michael was characterized as formerly a notorious rioter and leader of a faction. Instead, he settled into the role of community patriarch. However, as an ally of local landlords and as a strong farmer, his political tendencies leant towards the established social and political order. The Kerry Evening Post recalled that he took an earnest and most active part in the desperate election contests that were held in this county, both before and after the Reform Bill of 1832, as an ally to the Landlord and Conservative Party. The Kerry Evening Post also observed, so heartily did he work for the successful election of Arthur Blennerhassett in 1837, that he was presented after the election by the Carlton Club, a London gentlemen's club established for MPs and supporters of the Conservative Party, with a valuable silver snuff box, which he treasured with pride to his dying day. A public meeting held in Killorglin in 1837 to support local magistrates, at which Michael spoke, finished with calls for 3 cheers for McGillicuddy of the Reeks, a kind and considerate landlord. 3 cheers for David Peter Thompson, who as an agent is kind and forbearing. 3 cheers for Judge Day and the landlords of Kerry. The Conservative supporting Kerry Evening Post, encouraging Kerry tenants to be loyal to their landlords in the way that they voted, advised them to look to strong farmers, like the Foleys of Killarton, who will tell them plain and wholesome truths conducive to their interests and cementing the ties between them and their natural protectors. A few verses written, different verses written about Michael, and I'll just finish the section with one of those. Mick's role in the Kilgovernant fight of the early 1800s remained part of local history into the 1920s, when a song about a well-regarded storyteller listed the many tales that the storyteller could recite. And this is the verse. He'll tell you of the patron of the ructions and the battering at Kilgovernant when the faction fights began, how they always kept on fighting and slashing took delight in until Big Mick Foley cleared them with his clan. The third and last group of factions I'll talk about are the factions of North Kerry, where factions were very long-lived and fighting was very intense. This was the stamping ground of 2 famous gangs, the Cooleens and the Lawlors. These 2 factions engaged in the unfortunate Battle of Ballyeagh in 1834, when between 18 and 29 people were reported to have been killed. During the 1830s, it was said that the Cooleens and the Lawlors had been feuding for above half a century, and thus perhaps since the 1780s. The Lawlors fought in combination with their allies, the Mulvihills, also known as the Black Mulvihills. The Lawlors and Mulvihills came chiefly from the northernmost barony of Kerry, Irishmen, and the Cooleens came mostly from Clanmaris, the barony to the south. Their nickname was said to have derived from the fact that a number of them came from places which began with the prefix Cool, which meant corner. Different issues were later suggested to have inspired the factions' long-lived hostility towards each other, such as an argument over the sale of a horse or the comparative merits of potatoes grown in each other's districts. In fact, the factions' hatred of each other may have had a more banal source. The Cooleens were Kerry natives, while the Lawlors and the Mulvihills were comparative outsiders. In the early 1600s, the Lawlors had been among 7 strong families transplanted from Queen's County, County Laois, where they had been regarded as too hostile to the English plantations established there. They were subsequently settled around Tarbert in Irishmen. Similarly, in the mid-1600s, the O'Briens, Lords of County Clare, who owned the lordship of Tarbert, settled many Clare families in North Kerry, including the Mulvihills. The Cooleens and the Lawlors often met at Listowel. Indeed, both groups were characterized in 1826 as the Listowel factions. And in 1834, it was said that scarce a fair day passed at Listowel without a serious fight. Ardfert, too, was for many years the theatre of bloodshed between rival parties known as the Cooleens and the Lawlors. Over the course of the 2 gangs' long existence, several notable fighters stood out, and stories about them continue to be remembered among the people of North Kerry. These memories were afterwards collected by the Irish Folklore Commission during the 1930s. By far the most famous of these men was Seón Burns, who fought with the Cooleens. Seán was a well-to-do farmer from Duaugh. According to a folklore source from the Listowel area, he was a powerfully built man, standing about 5 feet 11 inches high, with shoulders like a giant and weighing about 17 stone. One of the most popular stories about Seán related how one St. Patrick's Day, a drinking buddy, local magistrate Major Galway, persuaded him to pretend to be extremely drunk in the street in front of one police constable Malloy, who was an unusually strong man who had only recently arrived in Abbeyfield, just over the county bounds in West Limerick. Malloy grabbed Burns, but the latter shoved him away. When he caught him again, Burns seized him with one hand, lifted him over his head into the air, and put him sitting in a cart. All the onlookers cheered, and this roused the anger of the officer, who again made for his prey, only to be again seized and put sitting in the middle of the street. Mr. Galway told Burns to put the officer to bed. Burns took hold of him and put him inside the barracks door to end his bravery. A folklore informant saw Burns fight in Listowel, and he said, "I remember to see Seán walking the square in Listowel, and he shouting, 'A Burns and a Cooleen,' against any three of any other name." Another day, Burns was in Listowel alone, and the folklore informant explained, "A number of men wanted to beat him, and Seán had nobody with him. He saw that there were too many of them against him, and he had no way of saving himself. He faced a donkey's cart and tore it asunder like a matchbox. He took one of the shafts out of it, and he cleared his men out of the town." Seán appears to have died sometime during the 1870s. There were many heroes on both sides of this conflict, but as well as men being involved, women also had an unusual role among the factions. Sometimes they fought, but most of them had the role of banfilla, partisan songwriters who would quickly conjure up verses in Irish to celebrate their heroes and to mock their rivals. Thomas Culhane collected some of these verses during the 1960s. He explained that on one occasion, as Geroid Mulvihill was leading his party into a fight in Listowel, Kate Flavin, a poet of the Cooleens, shouted out, "Here comes Geroid the show-off and his hat stuffed with hay." In return, Nancy Keane for the Mulvihills addressed Sean Sheehy as the Cooleens came up. "Who is that petty old wastrel with a band of weaklings around him? Is it not filthy Seán from the dung heap, silly Seán with his big head infested with lice?" Unfortunately for Sheehy, the name of his home place could be interpreted literally as the dung heap. Keane then looked to the champion of her own party in contrast, and she said, "May God raise you up, O vigorous Geroid, you the multitude's chosen one. Never did you fail in battle, my dear one. Strike at the devil and all the Cooleens." And I'll just finish with this paragraph. Unfortunately, this fighting spirit and these fighting heroes engaged in the most fatal of Kerry faction fights when they met after the horse races which were run on the 24th of June 1834 at Ballyeagh. A huge number of men and women gathered for a conflict which transformed into a riot which left many dead and resulted in the transportation or imprisonment of several men. In the book Days of the Blackthorn, I give a very detailed account of the fight and its causes and consequences, but that tragic event is probably better read about than discussed tonight. And that's the end of my talk as such.
Okay, sorry, I just was trying to get back to where I was. Here's this at the end of the slides, I think. So thank you very much, Seán. Apologies for that. I was just trying to get out of it.
I just let you know I've lost the video, but I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we did have a number of questions. I know that some came in today. I don't know if you have them there in front of you, Seán.
I can just about remember them. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just see if I can find them myself.
Okay.
And so there's from Michael. Okay, yeah. So there was one question: was faction fighting an early form of trade unionism or protectionism of local employment interests?
I don't tend to think so. As I say, in a Kerry context, faction fighters were basically wealthy farmers who wanted to display their status in the community. There is some evidence that in County Tipperary, factions were divided among class lines. So in terms of the Caravats and the Shanavests, the old waistcoats, were wealthy farmers, while the Caravats were small farmers or labourers. So there was a kind of a social class element in the Tipperary factions. But in terms of the Kerry factions, I couldn't see the same correlation. And indeed, it seemed to be wealthy farmers fighting other wealthy farmers.
And let me just see if I can find that second question there as well from Michael. To what extent did landlords exploit faction fighting in the employment of migrant labourers?
In terms of employing migrant labourers, I don't see any correlation, but it is very true that the landlords had relationships with the factions. So on the one hand, landlords who were often magistrates were expected to condemn and control factions, but there's evidence that some landlords kept factions almost like their favourite football team. So Thomas Ponsonby of North Kerry was an ally of the Lawlors, and we've already seen that Big Mick Foley and the Foley family as landlords were allies of Protestant land owners and landlords. So there was a kind of a relationship there.